Hello and welcome. In this video, I will be covering the basics of Unity 2022. Unity is a general purpose game engine. It is both flexible and powerful. It is a great tool to learn for those who are new to games or seasoned game developers alike. I will start by showing you how to download and install Unity, then I'll explain the interface and how to navigate the various menus and panels, and finally we will look at how to add objects into a scene to begin creating your first project. Let's start by going to unity.com, where we can download Unity Hub and select the specific Unity version we want to install. So here we are at the Unity website. The creators of Unity are constantly adding new features, so each version of the engine is a little bit different. From the Unity Hub, you'll be able to download any of the most common version numbers. So let's start by clicking the Download Unity button. And if you're on a Windows computer, you can download for Windows. If you're on a Mac, it may show up as download for Mac, or you may have to choose download other versions. And from here, you can also choose download for Mac or instructions for Linux. You also have the ability to choose from the download archive if you need a very specific version of Unity that is not one of the common versions that is currently available on the hub. But for now, I'm going to choose download for Windows because I am on a Windows computer. Once that is done, I will run the exe that was just downloaded, and I will agree to their terms of service and choose a place to install. Once you have installed Unity Hub, you'll be greeted with a landing page that looks like this, and you'll be asked to either sign in or create an account. You can create a free personal account for Unity and then log in with that account information, and you'll be ready to get started. Once you have logged in to the Unity Hub, you will want to start by installing a version of Unity. The Unity Hub is just a landing page where you can access different versions of Unity and different Unity projects. It is not the Unity engine itself. So you'll want to navigate to the Installs tab, and as you can see, I actually have quite a few versions of Unity installed. Yours probably does not have any installed yet, so you'll want to choose Install Editor, and then select a version to install. I am going to select a 2022 version for this demo. However, you can use any version that has long-term support, and you will most likely find it pretty straightforward to use and pretty similar. But I'm going to proceed with a version of 2022. When you select the version you want to install of Unity, then you will be presented with this modules page where you can choose different modules to include in your project. You will most likely want to include Visual Studio, which allows you to write C# scripts, which is the programming language used for Unity. You may also want to choose some specific build platforms. I recommend generally including a couple of different build platforms that you might want to experiment with. In particular, Android and iOS are great if you want to develop for mobile. One thing to note about iOS build support is that you must be on a Mac computer in order to build for iOS, or you will need access to a Mac computer to do the final step of the build process. So I'm not going to install iOS build support since I'm on a Windows computer, but I will include Android build support. Another useful one is the WebGL build support. This makes it pretty easy to build a game that can run in the web browser, which is pretty useful in a lot of cases. So I will select these modules and I will choose continue. I will agree to their license terms, and then I will continue. I will agree again, and then I will run the install. Now this takes a little bit of time, so I'm going to pause the video while this download and install finishes. Once your install has finished, you can navigate to the Projects tab where you can create a new project. And if you have multiple versions of Unity installed, you can choose the version you want to use from this dropdown. So I'll be using a version of 2022 to continue with this demo. And you can also choose what type of project to create. When you're just getting started, I recommend starting with 2D Core or 3D Core, depending on if you want to make a 2D game or a 3D game. So I'm going to go ahead and proceed with creating a 3D starter project, and you can name your project here, and you can also choose where you want to save your project. I will just change this to the name of this video, Unity Basics 2022, and I will go ahead and create my project. And it'll take just a moment to create the project, so I'll pause the video while it's loading up. So here we are in Unity, and one last thing I wanted to mention as you are waiting for your install to finish is that Unity does take up a fair amount of space on your computer, and so if you don't have a lot of free space on your computer, it'll be best to only have one version of Unity installed at a time. But once you have it installed successfully and you have opened it up, you will see the Unity editor, which looks something like this. Let me show you around just a little bit. We have over on the left-hand side the hierarchy. These are things that are in your scene. You will see two things in the scene by default, a main camera and a direction light. You can click on them in the hierarchy and it will select them in the scene view. The center of your screen here is the scene view, which is where you can see things that are in your scene. You can move around your scene using the middle mouse button to pan and the right mouse button to rotate. You can also use Alt and click to rotate in a slightly different way. Right clicking to rotate rotates around, essentially around yourself, your own view, and Alt click and rotate rotates you around whatever is the focus point of what you are looking at. So those are a few different ways you can move around the scene. If you are using a trackpad, it is a little bit more difficult, so I do recommend using a USB mouse when working with Unity. It does make the interactions quite a bit more user-friendly. The other important panel is over here on the right-hand side. We have the inspector, which gives you some information about the item you have selected. So I have the direction light selected, and so I can see some information about my direction light. I can see what type of light it is, what color it is, how intense the light is, and some additional light settings that are not terribly important right now, but perhaps you will want to learn how to change those later on when you work more with lighting. If I select the main camera, we can similarly see some of the camera settings in the inspector. Next up is the project panel, which is down here at the bottom and shows you all of the folders that you have in your project. It is all collected under this main folder called Assets. And if you open up a subfolder, for example, if I open up the Scenes subfolder, I can see that there is a sample scene, which again comes by default when you create a new 3D Unity project. You get a 3D sample scene. You can also create additional things in the project panel by right-clicking and choosing Create. And for example, if I wanted to create another subfolder for maybe I am going to add audio to my project, so I would want a subfolder called Audio, and then here is where I could import audio files. Similarly, I might create a folder for art and maybe a folder for animations and a folder for scripts. These would be some of the main types of subfolders that you would want to include in your project. There is also a game view, which you can toggle between with the scene view. So here the scene view is selected. If I select game, now this is showing me what my game looks like currently, and it is showing you what the camera sees. So the main camera in the scene is seeing this default Unity skybox. The skybox, if you pan around in your scene, you can see that the skybox comes by default with the sample scene. So that is what I see currently in the game view. When you hit the play button up here at the top, you can see what happens when you are playing your game. And so it will automatically launch you into the game view, and you can see what your game currently looks like. If there was anything happening in my game, I would see it happening right now. One thing that's very important to know is that while you are in play mode, anything you attempt to change is not being saved. And so you should not attempt to make any changes while you are in play mode. You should always click the play button again to get back out of play mode before making any changes. Let's go ahead and add some stuff to our scene. So I'm going to go up to the Game Object menu at the top, and then I am going to choose 3D Object. And let's start by creating a plane. And when you create an object, it'll have the name of it highlighted, so you can rename it if you would like. So I'm going to call this Ground, and I'll double click on it to bring it into focus so that I can zoom in on it and rotate around it. And so this is a plane in Unity, and you can see where it is positioned over here in the inspector. You can also zero out the position if it creates it somewhere other than where you want it to be. You can reset the position to 0, 0, 0, and I'll double click on it again to see where it is at now. Generally, you want to build things sort of around the center point of your scene as your starting point, and you can build out from there. Now, I'd probably like to be able to change the color of my ground, and so I'm going to create something called a material. Before I create a material, I also want to create one more new folder, which will hold all of my materials. So I will name this materials, and then I'll go inside of that folder, and then I will create a material. So when you choose the create menu, and then material is about halfway down. And then this is a material type of thing. So I can name the material. I could call it ground mat, short for ground material. And then I can specify some things about this material. One of the things you can change is the color. That is called albedo here. So you can select a color from this color picker. So maybe I want to pick a sort of a brown color. You can see a preview down here. Maybe this is grass, so I want to choose green, or maybe I'm indoors, so it's actually like a carpet, so I could choose whatever color I want my carpet to be. But I'm going to go ahead and choose green, actually. And once you choose your color, one thing you might notice is that it is actually a little bit shiny. You can change the shininess by changing this slider that says smoothness. If you take the smoothness all the way up, you can see it makes it very shiny, and we can bring it all the way down to the bottom so that it is not shiny. And now I can drag this onto my plane. I just click on it from the folder, and then I drag, and then I release it onto the object that I want to apply the color to. So now I have this green grass plane for my scene, and if I go to the game view right now, I can see it from my camera. My camera is not actually in the center of the scene. If I double click on my camera, I can see it is over here by default. Perhaps I want to actually bring it to the center of my screen, or my scene rather, or close to the center of my scene. So maybe I'll place it right here. I could also increase the size of my plane so it fills more of the area. And when you have the camera selected, you can see a preview down here of what it will look like. You can also switch to the game tab to see what it looks like. But now I have this green grass that goes in every direction, and it comes up here to the gradient of the default skybox. So let's add some more stuff to this scene. I am going to add another 3D object. I'm going to add a cube. So here is my cube. I can position it wherever I want it to be. And if I look in my game view, I can see where it is at. Maybe I want it sort of in front of the camera. I'm going to create another material. And maybe this I will make red. And I want to turn down the smoothness again because I don't actually want this to be shiny. When you click and drag your material, you can see a preview of what you are applying it to. So when I hover over the ground, it shows me what it would look like if I applied it to the ground, or I can move so I'm hovered over the cube. So now my cube is red. This is a pretty big cube, so I'm going to actually scale it down a little bit and position it just slightly above the ground. So I can see it in my game view. This is what it looks like. Let's say perhaps I want to add some physics into my game, and maybe I want this to be a button that can be pressed down by an object falling on top of it. Maybe I'll have something the player can bring over to the button and place on top of it, and the object falling on top will cause the button to go down. And so without implementing any player behavior, I can actually set up some physics pretty easily. I'm going to create one more new 3D object. This time I'm going to create a sphere. I'm going to position it above my cube. I'm going to make sure it's lined up with my cube by first placing it slightly inside of the cube so I can see that they are lined up. And then I will raise it up above the cube and maybe scale it down a little bit. And I'm also going to give it a material as well. And I'm going to make this blue. And I'm going to go ahead and leave this one shiny, actually. So this is going to be a shiny ball. Maybe it's sort of like a bouncy ball. And it's going to fall onto my cube. You can also see that both of these objects cast shadows by default. This is because the direction light is set up to cast shadows, and so these shadows are happening by default without needing to do anything special. I'm going to select my sphere in my scene. I'm actually going to rename this sphere to ball, and I'm going to rename my cube to button. It's helpful to keep your hierarchy organized so you can see what you are doing. One other thing that is helpful is to save frequently. You can use Control-C to save on Windows or Command-C on Mac, but it is important to save frequently so that you don't lose your progress. As we are creating things in the scene, one other thing I want to mention is the scene itself does not actually have a lot of information about your project. And so if you were ever to try to copy your files somewhere else, the scene file is not actually enough. You can see that, for example, I have these materials saved in my materials folder. And so the scene data doesn't know all of the other things that are in your project. And so chances are, if you need to copy your project, you need all of the things that are in your folders and not just the scene. So it is important to distinguish the scene from your project. Your project could also have multiple scenes, which is pretty common. So back to what I was working on in my scene. So I have my ball and my cube. I'm going to apply some physics to my ball. So I'm going to add a component called rigid body. A rigid body allows an object to be part of Unity's physics engine, and so it can have physics applied to it. You can see it will have mass and drag and whether or not it uses gravity, as well as some other details. And so if I just go ahead and hit play right now, I didn't make any changes, I just left it as its default. Now the ball automatically falls. It falls straight down and it lands on the button. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the play button. I'm going to hit play one more time just so we can see that once more. So the ball falls down and it lands on the button. Make sure that you always turn off play mode so that you can make changes. So don't attempt to make any changes while you are in play mode. The next thing I'm going to do is add the rigid body component to my button as well. And this time I am going to make a change. I am going to tell the button that it does not use gravity. Use gravity would cause it to fall automatically, but I actually just want it to react when the ball falls on top of it. So I want the ball falling on top of it to be able to push the button down. Now let's go ahead and hit play and see what happens. So now, when the ball falls onto the button, it pushes the button down, and the button collides with the ground, and then it stops moving downward. The ball then falls off and rolls away. So let's play that one more time and watch. So the ball pushes the button down, and then the ball rolls away. Maybe I want this to look a little bit more believable as a button. It's just sort of floating in the air right now. And if I wanted to have sort of a box around the button, so it looks like the button is being pressed in to something, I'm going to go ahead and create another cube. And I am currently focused on the button. So when it creates the cube, it creates it right where the button is. So I'm going to create it just sort of around the button. So I want it to be bigger than the button, but go around the button. Now, even though it does not have a rigid body, it does have a collider, which means it is going to interact with the physics that I have going on right now. And I actually just want this to be a visual container. I don't actually want it to interact with the physics in any way. So I'm going to remove this box collider component. You can right click on box collider and then choose remove, and now it will not interact with any of the physics. The colliders, even though it didn't have a rigid body on it, the collider will still cause other objects to react to it in the scene. So now I have this button container. I am going to make one more new material. Actually, yeah, I'm going to make one more new material. So I'll make a new material, call it container, and I am going to make this purple color, and I'll once again turn down the smoothness, And I'll apply it to my button container. I'm actually going to make that a little bit darker. All right, so now let's hit play and see that in action. So now I have my button being pressed down inside of the box, and I can see that the ball did not interact with the box, which is great. However, now the button is completely hidden by the box, and I actually do want the top of the button visible still. So what you can do is you can pause while you are in play mode. You can pause and you can find your objects to see how much you need to change them by. Now remember, you do not want to make changes while you are in play mode. It will not be saved, but we can figure out how far we need to move the container down. So it's about twice as tall as what I actually want it to be. So instead of unpause, I'm going to hit unplay, and then I can modify this button container, and we can play again and see if that has accomplished what I was looking for. That's pretty close. I actually don't want this container to go too much lower, or it's actually going to be below the button entirely. So I might actually want to lower the button slightly from here. Otherwise I will actually have space in between them. One other thing I want to do is to get a better view of what is going on here. I am actually going to raise the camera up slightly. Since currently the player cannot control the camera, I can specify where I want the camera to be so I can get a nice view of the interaction that's going on here. So I'll go ahead and run it one more time. Now the button gets pressed all the way down and the ball still rolls off to the side. Perfect. So the last thing that I want to do is I want to have something happen as a result of the ball pressing the button. So I want the ball pressing the button to trigger some kind of effect. And to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that I am going to have like a coin that the player collects by pressing this button. And even though I don't have the interaction for the player walking around and picking up this ball and placing it on the button, I can set up the trigger so that when the button gets pressed down, a coin gets collected. So I'm going to create another new object, 3D object, and this time I'm going to create a cylinder. So here's my cylinder, and I can make this cylinder to look like a coin by scaling it down and rotating it so that it is vertical. I'm actually going to, once I kind of see how I want to rotate it, I'm going to manually choose a rotation over here, and I'm actually going to choose 90 as my X rotation. And then if I rotate around the Z-axis, I can see this rotation happening to the coin. I'm actually going to have the coin spinning continuously until it is collected, so I can show how to create an animation in Unity. Animations are really useful for making the player feel like things are interactive and responsive to them, and make it feel like the environment is interesting to look at and to participate in. So we're going to add an animation to this coin. Before I create the animation, I want to start by creating a material for my coin. So I will create one more new material. This is going to be yellow, and I'm going to go ahead and leave this one shiny. So I'll drag this onto my coin. So now this kind of looks like a giant coin. Let's see it in the game view. Maybe it's a little too close to the camera. So I'm going to make it easier to move around. I am going to reset the Z rotation to 0 while I get it positioned where I want it. I might also scale it down just a little bit. And then I am ready to create my first animation. So if I go back up to the assets folder and I navigate to my animations folder, which is currently empty, I can create a new animation, which is down even farther down the materials. So down about 2/3 of the way down. I'll choose animation, not animator controller. Animator controller allows you to switch between animations, but I actually want to make the animation itself. And so I'll click on that, and then I'm going to actually name this animation spin. So my animation is going to spin around, so I've called my animation spin. And then I'm going to select my cylinder in the hierarchy, I'm going to rename it as coin. And I'm going to take the spin animation and drag it down here to where it says add component. So if you drag the animation from your animations folder to the add component spot, it will add a component which is actually an animator controller component, but it tells it which animation to play, which is going to tell it to play my spin animation. So it has created an animator controller called coin. It is using the name of the object, but if I select this and I go to a new window, if I go to window and animation and then animator, here I can see the spin animation. So this is the spin animation here, and the animator controller is telling this object to play this animation by default. I'm not going to modify the animator controller. I just wanted to show you that this is where it specifies the animation to play. I'm actually going to go ahead and close out of this tab because I'm not going to use that window. However, I am going to use the animation window, which is not the animator window, but the animation window. And when I open it up, it'll look like this. It probably pops open in a free window like this, and you may want to, especially if you're on a single screen, you may want to take this tab and drag it. And I like to keep it down here at the bottom. If you drag around, you can see you can actually put it a bunch of different places. There's a lot of different ways to configure your setup in Unity. But I'm going to drag it down here. So if you drag it along this straight edge down here, what you can do is you can make it an alternate tab with the project. The other one here is console. This will let you know if you have any errors, if you're writing any code. But I've now added the animation tab down here. And now I'm going to select my coin, and I'm going to choose add property. And the property I want to add is under transform. If you click this little triangle, and then I want to add a rotation property. So I'm going to click the little plus. If you are on a monitor with a very low resolution, you may have a scroll bar at the bottom, and you may have to scroll to the right to see the plus button. But if you see rotation and then you select the plus button, it will add 2 keyframes. Keyframes let you specify certain states of an animation, and then Unity will interpolate between them, and so it will attempt to fill in the data between your keyframes. So what we're going to do now is create a new keyframe on our timeline, and if you click and drag up here where the numbers are, you can scrub along the timeline. This, if you have multiple keyframes, this would allow you to see how the animation will work. But you could also use this to pick a point somewhere else on the timeline. Let's say I pick the point right here, and I want to add a new keyframe. There's a couple different ways you could do this. You could edit the values of the rotation here. You could also right click and add a key, but if you add a key this way, it won't have any changes to it yet. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to switch to the rotator tool. I'm going to figure out which way I want the key, the coin to animate. So I want the coin to rotate around this axis. So I'm going to start rotating. And so I rotate for a little bit, and I can see that it updates the value here. And now I'm going to right click and create a keyframe. So I'll right click and choose add key. And now if I scrub along the timeline, I can see that animation. Now, by default, it will have an end animation that is the same value as the start keyframe of the animation. So right now, it rotates halfway and then it rotates back. So now that I can kind of visualize what the coin is doing, I can figure out what do I actually want my animation to do. So I'm going to come down here to this last keyframe, and I'm actually going to delete this last keyframe. And I'm going to adjust the Z rotation. This is the one that was changing when I was scrubbing along the timeline. So I'm going to change this to -360. So this will allow me to make a full rotation. And when I make that change and press enter, it automatically makes a keyframe for that. Now I don't actually need this middle one because I have created an end one. So if you select this middle one and choose delete, now if we scrub along the timeline, we can see a full rotation. One other thing that we can change about this, so this is making a full 360-degree rotation, but it is only going to play once by default. If we go back to our project tab and we select our spin animation, we can check this box up here in the inspector called loop time, and this will cause the animation to loop. Now, if we hit play, we should be able to see that animation looping continuously. However, you will notice that it starts slow and it speeds up, and then it slows back down at the end. This might be what you want. However, perhaps you want it to spin continuously. And if you want it to spin continuously at the same speed, let me show you how you would make that happen. I'm going to once again select my coin and go back to my animation window. And instead of this dope sheet tab, this is the tab that has the keyframes on it, you can switch to the curves tab, and this controls how it speeds up and slows down. It's a little bit difficult to navigate by default. If you select the thing you want to animate over and you press F, it will center that curve in your view, which makes it a lot easier to edit. So I want to edit the curve for the Z. And if you select either end, what you can do is you can kind of straighten these out. So you can make this, you could make it gradual if you want, or you can make it go the other way. You can modify these however you want. But if you want to make it a straight line, you can just drag them so that it is approximately a straight line. And now if we press play, we can see that in action. So now it is rotating continuously and smoothly. All right, so that is adding an animation. So now we have our coin animating, and the next thing that we want to do is we want to have, when the button gets pressed, that it will destroy the animation. And this is actually going to require a script. So this will be our first script. So I'm going to go into the scripts folder, and I'm going to right click and create a C# script. And be very careful when you create a C# script. The default, it will give it a new behavior as the name. And if you click off of it and then click back on it to rename it, renaming the script will cause the script not to work correctly, and unless you modify the script, which is a little bit of extra work. And so rather than doing that, if you accidentally click off of it, for now, I'm going to recommend that you delete it and try again. So once it is done deleting, we'll once again right click, create C# script, and we'll name it right away. We will call it collect. So I'm calling it collect because that is the action that's going to happen. It is going to collect the coin. So when we press the button, we will collect the coin. Now the question is, what do we attach this script to? When we're working with things in the scene in Unity, scripts can be attached to different objects, and they can apply things to different objects. So one way that we could do this, there's actually a few different ways, but the way that I'm going to do this is I'm actually going to attach the script to the coin itself. So the coin itself is going to have this script attached, and so to do that, very similarly to how we added the animation component, we're going to select the script from our folder and drag it down here to add component, and then release, and we will see collect script has been added. Now we can open up this script and cause something to happen. When you double click on the script, it should automatically open it up in Visual Studio. And if it does not automatically open in Visual Studio, if you are on a Mac, it is possible that when you install Unity, it did not automatically install Visual Studio. So you may need to install Visual Studio for Mac separately. However, if you installed Visual Studio when you installed Unity, then it should automatically open up Visual Studio when you double click on the script. So what I want this script to do is when I trigger the button, I want to collect the coin. And so I want the coin itself to have a function to cause it to become destroyed. And one way that I will do this is I will make a function that will handle that behavior. The script by default has these two functions, start and update. Start is called once when the object is first created, and update is called every frame. So every frame, if you think about this in terms of frame rate for a video game, and so most video games run at least 60 frames per second, and so that each frame of the update happens inside of this update function. But I'm going to go ahead and remove both of these, and I'm going to make my own function. I'm actually going to make a public function because I am going to call this function from another object. So the button itself is going to call this function. So we'll use public void and then the name of the function. I'm going to call this collect coin. And the void means that this function does not return anything. So I'm going to call this function when the coin should be collected. And for now, all I'm going to do is destroy the coin itself. To destroy the game object that this script is attached to, you just call destroy game object. So whatever game object the script is attached to, that game object will be destroyed when this function gets called. We're going to add more stuff here in a little bit, but for now we will just destroy this coin when it is collected. So I'm going to save this script. I'm going to go back to my Unity scene. And it'll take a moment to reload that script. And now, while I have the script selected, I should see in the preview over here that it has been updated to have that destroy line. I'm going to make another script that is going to talk to that script. So my second script is going to, it's going to be called button press. Now I'm not calling this button because I don't want to confuse it with the button component that comes with Unity's UI, and just to keep things very distinct, I'm going to call this one button press just so that I know this is my script. And once that is done loading, then I will double click on this to open it also in Visual Studio. So here's my second script. I can see now in Visual Studio both scripts appear as tabs up here. So I have my collect script and then I have my button press script. For the button press script, I once again want to change, I want to get rid of these two functions, but I want to add now a function that will be triggered automatically. And this is something called on trigger enter. And if you just start typing it in, you should see it populate here. And if you press enter, it will fill it all the way in. On trigger enter is a built-in function that will detect when the object that this script is attached to has entered a trigger, or when another object has entered its trigger. So we'll look at how to make the trigger in a moment. But basically what we want to do when a trigger event occurs is we want to find the coin and call its collect coin function. So in my button press script, I'm going to do a find function. So I'm going to call GameObject.find GameObject with tag. And so what we're going to do is we're going to locate an object with a specific tag. I'm going to tag it as collectible. And once I locate that object, so this is going to search in my scene, it's going to find an object with this tag. I haven't made this tag yet, but once I make this tag, it will find an object that has that tag. And then I can access a component on it. So I'm going to call getComponent. And I'm looking for the name of my script, which is called collect. GetComponent is a function, so it requires the open and close parentheses, which indicates that it's a function. Once I have access to that script, I can then call a function from that script. Since I made this function public, it is accessible elsewhere. So I can call collect coin and it will automatically fill in, and then I just need the open and close parentheses. And in C# we end a line of code with a semicolon. So this line of code will locate an object in our scene with the collectible tag. It will find the the script called collect attached to that, and it will call the function collect coin. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, Control S to save on Windows or Command S on a Mac. Then I'm going to come back to my scene. And now I need to attach my button press script to something. Now I could attach it to the button. However, I have this button set up to have a rigid body, so it will react to physics. And a trigger actually requires us to check this box, is trigger. And the problem with doing that on this button is once you mark is trigger, it will no longer receive the physics interaction. So it will no longer be pressed down. So instead, I'm actually going to put the trigger on this outside container. So I'm going to add a box collider component back onto this. It had a box collider component previously, which I removed, but now I'm adding this box collider back onto it, and this time I am checking this box is trigger. So now when this ball enters into this trigger, it will call the onTriggerEnter function. So it will call this onTriggerEnter function if this script is attached to one of the two objects. So I'm going to attach the script to this base, the button base. So the button base is actually going to handle the interaction. It is also a good idea to increase the size of this box collider just to make sure the ball will actually enter it. Remember, the outside box doesn't sink all the way inside. So we can adjust the size of the box collider. You can click and drag on one of these letters. So I can make it a little bit taller like this to ensure that the ball will actually enter the trigger. So now the trigger zone is a little bit bigger than the box itself. And I have already attached the button press onto it. So the last thing I need to do is I need to actually give the coin a tag. So I'm going to select my coin. I'm going to come up here in the inspector to tag where it says untagged, and I'm going to choose add tag here. So this is where you can add your own new tags. You may have noticed that it had a few tags by default. I'm not going to use any of these, and instead I'm going to make my own. So go to the add tag option, and then I'm going to add a new tag. In my script, I called it collectible. Let me make sure I spelled that the same. It is important that you spell it the same in the tag and in the script. Couldn't matter if I spelled it with an A or an I. So those are spelled the same, and it is cap sensitive, so capital C and capital C. So we should be good. Now, it does not automatically add that tag to the object. When you create a new tag, you have to come back to the object and then select the new tag that you created. So now my coin is tagged as collectible. I'm going to move the ball up higher so that I'll have longer to witness what's happening before it enters the trigger. And let's test it and see if it works. And it actually did not work. Let's see what happens. So here's a good example of seeing an error from a script. So let's go to our console and see what this error was. So it says null reference exception, object not set to an instance of an object. So if I double click on this, it'll take me to that line. And so it says that this object was not set to an instance of an object. So let me double check my spelling again. So we have collectible with a capital C, and it is getting the component collect, which is my script. So let me go back to this coin. So I have collectible here as my tag, and it does have the collect script here. So I'm going to run it again just to see it in action one more time. And I realize the reason it's saying this object does not exist is because the coin is actually being destroyed already. So the coin is being destroyed actually because the button intersected with the box. That's why the coin, it disappears immediately before anything else happens. So the issue that I'm having is that it is not based on the ball, but it is based on the button intersecting with the trigger. So what I am going to do instead is I'm actually going to attach the button press script to the ball instead. So the ball can also detect when it enters a trigger, and I think that will work better. So I'll come back to my coin, my button base, and I'm going to remove the button press component. And I'm going to go to the ball. And here I'm going to add a component in a slightly different way to show you how this works. So you can also start typing here. And here you can see what I mean about button being a component for the UI. So I didn't want to confuse my button script with this one. So I called mine button press. And so now I've attached it to the ball rather than to the base. So let's see if this fixes the problem. So now I have no error, and when the ball lands on the button, the coin disappears. Let's run it one more time to see. So the coin is spinning until the button is pressed, and then the coin disappears. Perfect. So the last thing I want to do is I want to add some feedback. So when the coin disappears, that's really abrupt. Generally in games, we like to see some kind of particle effects and hear some kind of sound effects. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. Before I do that, I am going to go ahead and save my scene, since I've made quite a few changes now. And I'm going to go back to my project. I'm going to make a new folder called resources. So this is a special kind of folder that you can load from. You can load something from the resources folder into the scene. So I'm going to make a folder here called resources, plural, resources with an S at the end. And what I'm going to put inside of here, I am going to make a new object in my scene. I'm going to make an empty game object in my scene, create empty, and I am going to name this effect. This is just an empty game object right now. And so this effect, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a particle system. So if I click add component and I start typing particle, I can add a particle system. Here we can see a default particle system. Just has these bright pink squares. And so the first thing that we want to do is we want to come down here to the renderer. The renderer tells it what it looks like, and we can see the reason it is pink squares is because there is no material. If you click on this little circle, you should see a couple of default particles. So you can select one of these default particles. You could also make your own particle if you wanted to, or you could find some on the Unity asset store. There's a lot of great free assets out there, but I'm going to, for this demonstration, just use the default particle. Now I want to make some changes to the way this particle effect happens. First of all, this is going to be for my coin, so I want these particles to be kind of a yellowish color. I also don't want them coming out continuously. I want them to do what's called a burst. So I'm going to open up this emission tab here, and the rate over time is 10. I'm going to change that to 0. Now there are no particles. I'm going to add a burst. I'm going to hit plus right here. And so now it creates a burst of them all at once. 30 might be too many. I'm going to set this down to 20. I'm going to make a few other changes. So first is I want to change the duration and the lifetime. Usually we set these to the same number just for simplicity. So I'm going to set these both to 2. So I have 2 for the duration, 2 for the lifetime. That's actually still a little too long. I'm going to set these both to 1. So now it's kind of a quick burst. I also tend to like them to move a little bit faster at the beginning, so might set this to 7. I'm not going to change the start size just yet. We're actually going to use something called size over lifetime in a moment. But there's a few other changes we could add here. We could give them gravity. So now after they burst, they start to fall. You might notice they are kind of going in one direction. The reason they're going in one direction like this is because of the shape. If we click on the shape and we open this up, we can see it is creating this cone. We can adjust the cone. We could instead have it come out as a sphere. I think this tends to look better for kind of like explosion type things. So have it come out of a sphere, and then as they burst out, then they start to fall. I mentioned we're going to change size over lifetime. If we come down here, we can find size over lifetime, and we'll check this box, and then I'm going to click on this curve here so we can modify the curve. So notice they start small and then they get big. Maybe I want them to get small again at the end. So we can add a key. This is similar to the keyframes we did for animations. So now we can adjust these keyframes and the angles of the curve. So now they start small, they get big, and then they go back to small. The other thing we could change is color over lifetime. One nice thing to do with particle effects with color over lifetime, it is a gradient, and it is nice to have them actually start transparent and then become opaque and then go back to transparent. So I'm going to click, if you click up here, you create a new little handle. and the alpha is how transparent it is. So I'm going to click on the first handle, make that 0 alpha, and the last handle and make that 0 alpha. So now they start transparent, they fly out, they get bigger, and then they become opaque, and then they go back to transparent and tiny. If we click on the game view, we can kind of see how that looks. If you feel like they are too big the whole time, and I kind of think that they are too big the whole time, then you can change the start size. So here I'm going to change the start size to 0.5. So they'll always be a little bit smaller. I do think I actually started them with too high of a start speed, so I'm going to drop it down to 4. And let's look in the game view again. So that's looking pretty good. We can also scale down the sphere that they are spawning from. So I'm going to come back down to my shape with the sphere, and we can adjust the radius. So we can drop this down to 0.4, maybe even smaller, 0.2. So now they are starting closer to the center of this sphere. We can change some other things about this if we wanted to. I think I'm going to leave the rest of these settings the same for now. Let's look in our game view one more time. It's looking pretty good. We could also add a velocity over lifetime. So we could have the speed. Let's see. If you click on these drop down arrows, you can change this to a curve. So I'm gonna, if you click on the yellow one, this is the Y. So we could have initially a higher Y velocity. And you can type in this number here. So we could set this to like, I think it's 1 is the highest. So now they are going up a bit before they start falling. If we wanted to actually make the falling happen less quickly, less abruptly, or not fall as far, we can adjust the gravity modifier. You don't actually have to use a whole number here. You could use a decimal. So if we drop this down to 0.5, now they spend more time up in the air and they only start to sort of fall towards the end. Let's see, what else do we want to change? I'm going to try a little bit lower speed again. So I'll drop this down to 2. So that's looking a little bit better. Once you're happy, you can play with this indefinitely. You can spend a lot of time just with the particle systems. But once you're happy with this, what we're going to do is we're going to uncheck the looping box. It's helpful to see it looping so you can see what's going on. But once you're done changing it, you want to uncheck the looping box and then take that effect, drag it into your resources folder, and it creates something called a prefab, and it turns blue in the scene. So this tells you that this object is a prefab. A prefab means it's something reusable that you can reuse more than once. So you'll see .prefab down here. Prefabs are really useful for making reusable content for games. So I have made this prefab in my resources folder, which means I can create it from one of my scripts. So in my collect coin script, I am going to call something called instantiate. This instantiate creates an instance of an object in the scene. And what goes inside of here, we can do resources dot load. So it'll allow us to load something from our resources folder. And we need to tell it the name. And the name I called it was effect. And then we need to tell it where to spawn, what position and rotation. So the position I want to use is the position of the coin itself. When the coin destroys, I want the particle effect to happen right where the coin was. So we access the current position with transform.position. Transform refers to the object itself that this script is attached to. So that is the coin. So it spawns wherever the coin was. This happens, by the way, before the coin gets destroyed. Then we need to give it a rotation. We don't really care about the rotation of it because it's a sphere. It's going out in every direction. So I'm going to do quaternion.identity. This is the 0, 0, 0 rotation. So this says that the rotation is the origin, the identity, which is 0, 0, 0. Technically, a quaternion has 4 values, so it's actually 0, 0, 0, 0. But for all intents and purposes, it's the same in this particular case. So let's go ahead and save that. And let's hit play and see what happens. I just realized I left my starter one in the scene. We actually do want to destroy this now. We don't want that in the scene anymore. So let's try again. All right, so my ball lands on my button, the coin gets destroyed, and the particle effect happens. Cool. So the last thing that would be nice to add is to actually have a sound effect when that particle effect plays. Generally, when you have a particle effect, you want a corresponding sound effect. There are many places to get free sound effects, so you don't have to create them for yourself, including the Unity Asset Store. However, I'm pretty fond of freesound.org, which lets you search for sound effects by specific terms that you're looking for. And I have found a collect item sound effect that I would like to use by Edeyes. So I'm going to download this sound effect and import it into my Unity project. You can also use a free voice recorder for your phone, and you can record different sounds so you can make yourself. It's called Foley, when you use objects together to make different sound effects, real life objects to create sounds for a virtual action to take place, which you can create your own sound effects, or you can find sound effects online. So I'm going to download and import this one into my project. When you have finished downloading the file you want to use, if we come back over here to our assets folder and then choose audio, and then locate in the folder the sound effect that you want to use, you can drag it into your audio folder to import it. And it will look something like this once you have imported it. Then you can attach this sound effect to something that you want to cause the sound effect to play. The easiest way to do this is actually to come back to your effects resource that we have made here. And if we want to edit this, we can double click on it. And now we'll see, actually if I switch back to my scene view instead of my game view, we'll see, I'll go back for a second to show you. So here I am in my scene view. If you double click on your effect, you should see the effect play, and this is in the prefab editor. So from the prefab editor, we can scroll down in the inspector and choose add component. And we're going to type in audio, and we are looking for audio source. This allows us to play a sound effect. And the important thing is to keep checked play on awake. This causes it to play automatically when the object gets created. Now we can come back to our audio folder where we have this sound effect. And I'm going to select my effect in the scene, scroll down to that audio source component, and drag this audio source into the audio clip slot. You could also locate it by clicking this little circle, and you could locate the sound effect that way. Now if we hit the back button, it will save the changes we made to that effect. And we can go ahead and save our scene, and let's try it out. So now it played the particle effect and the sound effect when we collected the coin. Let's run it one more time. So now what we have is we have some physics. We have a button that can be pressed that can trigger an interaction in the scene. We have an animation, we have a particle effect, and we have a sound effect. So that's really all the basics you need in order to get started making some cool stuff. The last thing that I will leave you all with is no game would be complete without some cool background music. So I'm going to show you just real quick how to add some BG music. So I'm going to make an object here called BG Music. I have imported a song from the free free audio library from YouTube, and I am going to add one more audio source. This is in the scene, so I'm just going to drag my music onto this audio clip slot. Still clicking play on awake, but since this is background music, I also want this to loop. I happen to know that the music I imported is a little bit loud, so I am going to turn down the volume. And now we will hit play. We'll save our scene first, and then we will hit play, and we will see the finished product. And now we have a little demo of physics, sound, animation, and particle effects. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll come back and watch some more. Thanks for joining me.